She swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills and lay down before a show. No announcement, no drama, just an attempt to stop everything. 16 years of beatings, more than 100 million records sold, 8 Grammy Awards, 2 sons buried decades later. The world crowned her the Queen of Rock and Roll. They saw 180,000 people screaming her name in Rio. They saw strength, fire, survival. But what if survival is not the same as healing? And what if the woman who filled stadiums never truly escaped the damage that almost ended her life? Years after that overdose attempt, Tina Turner stood alone at the 1,985 Grammy Awards and won 4 trophies in a single night, including Record of the Year. The industry that once doubted her age and independence now applauded her as a solo force. Private Dancer would go on to sell more than 20 million copies worldwide. What's Love Got to Do with It reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, making her one of the oldest female solo artists ever to top the chart. In 1988, she walked onto a stage in Rio de Janeiro and faced 180,000 paying fans, one of the largest audiences ever assembled for a solo performer. Under the stadium lights, she moved with precision and control, her voice steady, her presence undeniable. The woman who once tried to end her life before a show was now commanding a crowd the size of a city. But applause does not erase memory. Trophies do not cancel trauma. If she could rise from attempted suicide to global dominance, why did the shadows of violence and loss continue to follow her long after the world called her unstoppable? Anna Mae Bullock was born on the 26th of November 1939 in Nutbush, Tennessee, a small rural town shaped by cotton fields, segregation, and economic hardship. There were no signs that this child would one day fill stadiums. Her parents were sharecroppers. Money was limited. Stability was fragile. Arguments between her mother and father were frequent, loud, and unresolved. For a young girl, home did not feel secure. It felt temporary. When she was still a child, her mother left the marriage. There was no dramatic goodbye, no clear explanation. One day she was there, then she was gone. Her father left not long after. Anna Mae and her sister were sent to live with their grandmother. Abandonment became her first lesson in adulthood. Love, she learned early, could disappear without warning. The absence was quiet, but it stayed. At church, she discovered something different. When she sang in the choir, people listened. Her voice was strong, steady, unusually controlled for her age. In that space, she felt visible. Music offered structure where family had failed. Applause, even in a small congregation, filled the emptiness that departure had created. Performance became more than expression. It became reassurance. As she grew older, she moved to Street Louis to reunite with her mother. The reunion did not erase the earlier wounds. It simply changed the setting. Street Louis exposed her to rhythm and blues clubs, live bands, and a louder world that pulsed with possibility. She watched musicians command attention and saw how authority shifted when someone held a microphone. On stage, power looked tangible, but underneath ambition remained a deep sensitivity to rejection. Children who grow up feeling unwanted often become highly adaptive. They work harder, they tolerate more, they learn to read moods quickly. Anna Mae developed resilience, but it was resilience rooted in fear of being left again. Approval mattered, attachment mattered. Stability, even flawed stability, felt safer than uncertainty. Friends described her as energetic and driven, eager to be part of something larger than her small-town beginnings. Yet that hunger carried vulnerability. The need to belong can blur boundaries. The desire to hold on to love can override warning signs. When she later encountered a charismatic, established musician who offered direction and opportunity, she did not meet him as someone untouched by loss. She met him as a young woman shaped by abandonment, determined never to be discarded again. Nutbush gave her endurance, church gave her projection, Street Louis gave her ambition. But none of those environments taught her how to protect herself from control disguised as protection. The same emotional wiring that pushed her toward greatness would also tether her to someone who promised structure and delivered domination. Before the fame, before the violence, before the attempted suicide in the stadiums, there was a girl who simply wanted to be seen and kept. That foundation did not make her weak, it made her human. And it helps explain why survival, for her, would always be tangled with the fear of losing connection. In the late 1950s, Anna Mae walked into a Street Louis nightclub where a band called the Kings of Rhythm was performing. The band leader was Ike Turner. He was confident, disciplined, already respected in rhythm and blues circles. He carried authority effortlessly. For a young woman searching for direction and belonging, that authority looked like stability. At first, she was only an observer. Then one night, during a break, she took the microphone and sang. The room changed. Her voice cut through conversation and smoke. Ike noticed immediately. Talent like that could not be ignored. He invited her to rehearse. Soon she was recording. Opportunity arrived quickly, and with it came dependence. He renamed her Tina Turner. The name was powerful, marketable, sharp, but it was also strategic. Ike legally registered it. If she left, he could replace her and continue using the brand. From the beginning, identity and control were intertwined. What appeared to be mentorship also carried ownership. They married in 1962. Publicly, they became Ike and Tina Turner, a rising musical force. Their live performances were electric. Tina's movements were explosive, her voice raw and commanding. Audiences saw chemistry, ambition, success in motion. The partnership looked equal under stage lights. Behind closed doors, the structure was different. Ike controlled finances, contracts, and schedules. Decisions flowed through him. Perfection in rehearsal was enforced with intimidation. When anger surfaced, it did not stay verbal. The first act of violence was shocking. The second was confusing. After that, it became part of a pattern. Success accelerated in the late 1960s. A Fool in Love brought attention. River Deep, Mountain High expanded their sound. By 1972, Proud Mary earned them a Grammy Award. They toured relentlessly, crossing into rock audiences and opening for major acts. Tina's presence became the centerpiece of the show. But the more visible she became, the less independent she felt. Fame amplified the illusion of power while reinforcing private confinement. Contracts remained in his name. Money moved through his hands. The band revolved around his authority. Leaving would not only mean emotional separation, it would mean financial collapse. Abuse rarely begins at its most extreme level. It escalates. Apologies follow incidents. Promises follow apologies. Then tension rebuilds. Trauma bonding forms when fear and affection intertwine. Tina learned to navigate this cycle. She monitored moods, anticipated triggers, adjusted behavior to reduce escalation. Survival required calculation. On stage, she embodied strength. Off stage, she absorbed control. The duality intensified over time. Audiences cheered a woman who looked fearless. In private, fear structured her days. The contradiction became exhausting. For someone shaped by childhood abandonment, leaving felt dangerous. Attachment, even painful attachment, felt familiar. Stability, however flawed, felt safer than stepping into the unknown. The path she entered promised elevation. Instead, it narrowed into confinement disguised as partnership. By the early 1970s, the brand was thriving. The marriage was deteriorating. The public narrative celebrated their synergy. The private reality operated on intimidation and control. The gap between image and truth widened each year. And when success peaks while autonomy disappears, the cost does not remain hidden forever. By the early 1970s, Ike and Tina Turner had reached what looked like undeniable success. Proud Mary won a Grammy Award in 1972. Their performances were relentless, explosive, tightly choreographed. Tina's legs moved with precision, her voice tearing through amplifiers with controlled force. Television appearances multiplied. They opened for major rock acts, including the Rolling Stones. The crossover from R&B to rock expanded their audience beyond traditional boundaries. From the outside, this was dominance. Night after night, she stepped onto stage platforms under blinding lights and delivered controlled chaos. Sweat, sequins, choreography, stamina. The audience saw a woman in command. She looked untouchable. Her energy felt limitless. She held the microphone like authority itself. The image solidified. Strength, independence, fire. But performance can also become armor. Behind the curtains, reality operated on a different script. There were nights when arguments erupted hours before showtime. Nights when physical violence left marks that makeup had to conceal. Nights when she performed with pain masked by adrenaline. The applause drowned out what happened before the spotlight turned on. The schedule intensified everything. Tours stretched across cities with little rest. Financial pressure mounted despite commercial success. Cocaine use escalated Ike's volatility. Paranoia seeped into rehearsals. Musicians learned silence. Tina learned anticipation. She adjusted posture, tone, timing, anything to prevent another eruption. Hyper-awareness became instinct. The paradox deepened. The stronger she appeared publicly, the more fractured she felt privately. Dissociation became a survival tool. On stage, she detached from fear and became pure movement. Off stage, she returned to tension. The same stamina that powered her performances also allowed her to endure violence without collapsing publicly. Media narratives praised her as fierce, unstoppable, liberated. Interviews framed the duo as dynamic equals. Photographs captured coordinated outfits and confident smiles. The world consumed an image of empowerment, while the foundation beneath it trembled. There is a psychological cost to sustaining two realities, one for the crowd, one behind closed doors. When identity splits between icon and captive, the strain accumulates silently. She was celebrated as a symbol of female strength at the exact moment she felt least free. Success did not soften the environment. It intensified control. The more profitable the brand became, the more tightly it was guarded. Contracts remained structured around Ike's authority. The name Tina Turner was still legally bound to him. Leaving meant risking erasure, financial ruin, and retaliation. By the mid-1970s, exhaustion was no longer only physical. It was existential. She could fill arenas, command applause, and win awards, yet none of it translated into safety. The gap between public power and private vulnerability widened until it felt unsustainable. The world saw a woman who looked invincible under white-hot lights. But how long can someone perform strength before the performance itself begins to crack? By the mid-1970s, violence was no longer an exception. It was a system. Tension built quietly. Rehearsals became rigid. Minor mistakes triggered major reactions. Then came the explosion. Afterward, apologies, promises, a short calm, then the cycle reset. Fame did not interrupt it. Fame concealed it. Ike controlled contracts, finances, touring schedules, and recording decisions. Every dollar passed through him. Financial dependence, limited options. Leaving was not just emotional risk, it was economic collapse. The name Tina Turner was legally his property. If she walked away, he could replace her and continue the brand. Erasure was built into the structure. Psychological control deepened the trap. She was told she was nothing without him, reminded that her success existed because of his direction. Years of repetition blurred confidence. Self-doubt is powerful when reinforced daily. Even a stadium full of applause cannot immediately override that conditioning. In 1968, overwhelmed and convinced there was no exit, she swallowed a bottle of sleeping pills before a scheduled performance. It was not an attempt staged for attention. It was an attempt to disappear. She survived. The show went on. The audience never knew how close the system had come to collapse. As success grew, so did volatility. Cocaine intensified Ike's paranoia. Arguments accelerated faster. Physical violence escalated. She learned to read micro-expressions, breathing shifts, tone changes, anticipating danger before it fully surfaced. Hypervigilance became instinct. Living in survival mode for years reshapes the nervous system. Calm begins to feel unfamiliar. By 1976, exhaustion had layered over fear. The brand was still profitable. Tours continued. Public interviews framed unity. But privately, the gap between image and reality had become unbearable. Another argument erupted in a Dallas hotel room. Another escalation. This time, something shifted internally. Not rage, not defiance, clarity. She did not pack belongings. She did not negotiate. She waited for an opening and walked out. Across a highway at night, alone, with 36 cents and a gasoline credit card. No security, no entourage, just traffic rushing past and the sound of her own footsteps. After 16 years under control, this was the first movement entirely directed by her. Leaving did not end the pressure, it intensified it. There were threats, attempts at reconciliation, legal complications, fear of retaliation. Escape is rarely clean, it is contested. It is tested. It demands repetition of the same decision under stress. Divorce proceedings stretched into 1,978. She faced a choice: fight for assets and endure prolonged conflict, or walk away financially stripped but legally free. She chose freedom. She kept only her stage name and accepted responsibility for hundreds of thousands of dollars in tour debts. Identity over money, autonomy over comfort. But autonomy did not bring immediate stability. The industry hesitated. Promoters doubted her viability without Ike. She was nearly 40. Youth dominated radio. Some quietly assumed her relevance had ended. She accepted smaller venues, casino performances, television appearances that paid modestly but kept her visible. Financial strain pressed daily. Media narratives questioned whether she could survive alone. Years of conditioning do not vanish overnight. Freedom feels fragile when structure disappears. The darkest phase was not only the abuse, it was the vacuum that followed. When control ends, silence begins, and silence forces confrontation with damage that performance once masked. The years immediately after the divorce were not triumphant. They were destabilizing. Freedom removed the violence, but it did not remove the imprint of it. Trauma does not vanish when the source disappears. It lingers in reflexes, in sleep, in the body's constant readiness for threat. Financial pressure intensified everything. She was responsible for substantial tour debts. Legal fees mounted. Record executives were cautious. Promoters questioned ticket sales without the familiar duo branding. She was approaching 40, and the industry rarely invests heavily in women at that stage of life. The unspoken message was clear: survival does not guarantee relevance. She performed wherever she was booked: Las Vegas casinos, smaller European venues, television guest spots. These were not the grand arenas of previous years. Applause returned, but at a different volume. Some audiences saw a comeback story in progress. Others saw a former star trying to hold on to visibility. The ambiguity was exhausting. Internally, the psychological aftershocks surfaced. Years of hypervigilance do not simply switch off. Loud noises triggered reflexive tension. Sudden changes in tone during conversations activated defensive responses. Trauma rewires instinct. The body continues reacting even when danger has passed. Publicly, she began speaking about abuse with measured clarity. Not for scandal, but for control of the narrative. Shame thrives in silence. By naming what happened, she reduced its power to define her in secrecy. Yet speaking does not equal healing. It is one step, not the conclusion. There was also grief. Grief for lost time. Grief for the version of herself that endured silently for years. Grief for relationships strained under pressure. Survivors often experience guilt. Guilt for staying, guilt for leaving, guilt for not leaving sooner. Survival carries complexity. Rebuilding required more than new contracts. It required recalibrating identity. For years, her strength had been reactive strength in response to threat. Now she needed constructive strength, strength that builds rather than defends. That transition is subtle but profound. The early 1980s were defined by incremental progress rather than explosive success. New producers, new musical direction, experimentation with contemporary pop-rock sounds. Europe responded first. The United Kingdom in particular embraced her reemergence. Gradually, radio resistance softened. When What's Love Got to Do with It eventually climbed the charts in 1984, the world framed it as a comeback miracle. What remained invisible were the 8 intervening years of doubt, debt repayment, rehearsals, and emotional recalibration. The public saw arrival. They did not see reconstruction. The darkest phase of her life was not confined to bruises or arguments. It extended into the fragile period after escape when she had to learn who she was without fear dictating her movements. When silence replaced chaos and silence demanded introspection, success would return, stadiums would fill, awards would accumulate, but the internal collapse that began years earlier did not simply evaporate. It transformed. It became awareness. It became caution. It became discipline. Survival is not a single act. It is a long adjustment to life after control, and the true test was not whether she could leave. It was whether she could rebuild without recreating the same patterns that once confined her. The real turning point did not begin with a stadium. It began with a shift in control. By the early 1980s, Tina Turner was no longer trying to prove she could survive without Ike. She was trying to redefine herself without him. That distinction mattered. Survival is reactive. Reinvention is deliberate. She began working with European producers who saw her not as a former duo act, but as a contemporary artist. The sound changed. Cleaner production, sharper arrangements, less chaos, more control. Her voice remained raw, but the delivery became measured. Strength no longer needed to be explosive to be convincing. In 1983, a cover of Al Green's Let's Stay Together gained traction in the UK. It was subtle, restrained, almost understated compared to her earlier performances. The response signaled something important. Audiences were ready to see her differently. Then came What's Love Got to Do with It? A song passed over by others. A track some believed did not fit her image. She recorded it anyway. Instead of overpowering the melody, she held back. The restraint gave the lyrics weight. A woman who had lived through violence singing about love without illusions carried quiet authority. When the song reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 Inches 1984, it was not just a chart victory. It was narrative reversal. She became one of the oldest female solo artists to top the chart. Age, once considered a liability, became evidence of endurance. Private Dancer followed, selling more than 20 million copies worldwide. In 1985, she won 4 Grammy Awards in one night, including Record of the Year. Cameras captured her standing alone on stage, steady, composed, self-contained. There was no visible triumph over an enemy. There was control. But this rebirth was not built on erasing trauma. It was built on integrating it. She did not pretend the past had not happened. She reframed it. Interviews became measured disclosures. She spoke about abuse without dramatizing it. She reclaimed authorship of her story. Touring expanded globally. In 1988, she performed at Maracanã Stadium in Rio de Janeiro before 180,000 paying fans, one of the largest audiences ever assembled for a solo artist. The scale was historic. Yet what made it powerful was not the number, it was the contrast. 12 years earlier, she had crossed a highway at night with 36 cents. Now she crossed a stage before a city-sized crowd. The distance between those two images defined the arc. What changed most was not her voice, not her choreography, not even her commercial appeal. It was leverage. Contracts were negotiated differently. Management reflected her authority. Decisions flowed through her, not around her. This was not the rebirth of a victim. It was the emergence of an executive presence. A woman who had once endured control now structured her environment deliberately. Autonomy became strategy. The world framed it as a comeback story, but internally, it felt like alignment. For the first time, her public power matched her private agency. Rebirth, in her case, was not dramatic. It was disciplined. It was layered over years of doubt, debt, and recalibration. The trophies symbolized success. The real victory was ownership. And once control shifted permanently into her hands, the question was no longer whether she could survive. The question became how far autonomy could carry her. After the global resurgence of the mid-1980s, Tina Turner did something rare in entertainment. She chose control over constant visibility. The tours continued through the late 1980s and 1990s, filling arenas across Europe and North America. Albums charted. Singles became radio staples. She recorded the theme song for a James Bond film, reinforcing her place in mainstream culture. By then, the numbers were settled over 100 million records sold worldwide and 8 Grammy Awards secured. But the deeper shift was structural. She no longer operated inside someone else's framework. Contracts reflected her leverage. Management answered to her. Touring schedules were built around sustainability rather than survival. The stage was no longer a place to escape fear. It was a platform she commanded by choice. In 1995, she moved permanently to Switzerland. The relocation was quiet, intentional. Distance from the American industry gave her privacy. In 2013, she became a Swiss citizen, formally stepping away from the country that had shaped both her rise and her suffering. The decision symbolized more than residency. It marked autonomy extended into personal life. Yet strength did not eliminate vulnerability. In later years, health challenges emerged: stroke, intestinal cancer, kidney failure. Public appearances became rare. The woman who once moved relentlessly across stadium stages now moved carefully, deliberately. Survival had always required adaptation. Aging required another form of it. Then came losses that no level of fame could buffer. In 2018, her son Craig died by suicide. In 2022, her son Ronnie passed away. These were private devastations, unfolding far from concert lights. The public remembered the icon. Privately, she endured grief that cannot be measured in sales or applause. The legacy she leaves is layered. She redefined longevity for women in rock. She demonstrated that reinvention after 40 was not only possible but commercially dominant. She helped shift public conversation around domestic violence by speaking without spectacle, naming abuse without surrendering dignity. But perhaps her most enduring impact lies in authorship. She chose when to leave. She chose how to return. She chose when to step back. The arc of her life was not smooth, but it was increasingly self-directed. The stadiums mattered, the Grammys mattered, the records mattered, yet none of them outweigh the decision to walk away from control and accept uncertainty instead. And when history remembers her, it will likely remember the fire on stage. What it should also remember is the discipline behind it, the years of rebuilding, the willingness to speak, the refusal to let trauma dictate the ending. Shall we move into the final reflection to close this story? Tina Turner's life is often summarized in numbers. 16 years of abuse, 36 cents in her pocket. More than 100 million records sold, 8 Grammy Awards, a stadium of 180,000 people rising to their feet. The scale is dramatic, the arc appears cinematic. But numbers alone do not explain the weight of survival. The world crowned her the Queen of Rock and Roll. They saw stamina, power, command. They saw a woman who looked untouchable under white-hot lights. What they rarely saw was the quieter truth that survival leaves marks even when success follows. Trauma does not disappear because applause grows louder. Grief does not soften because charts climb higher. Her story is not simply about leaving an abusive marriage. It is about rebuilding identity after control has shaped it for years. It is about speaking openly, without surrendering dignity. It is about choosing autonomy repeatedly, even when freedom feels uncertain. She survived violence, she survived obscurity, she survived global fame, she survived personal loss. Each phase demanded a different kind of strength. In the end, the most powerful image is not the stadium. It is a woman stepping into the dark with almost nothing and deciding that uncertainty is worth more than captivity. The world remembers her voice. Perhaps the deeper legacy is the choice behind it. And the final question remains: when strength becomes your public image, who understands the private cost it required to build it?